The slap echoed through the precinct hallway like a gunshot. It was 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in August 1952, and Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson stood in the booking area of the 28th precinct in Harlem, his hands cuffed behind his back, blood trickling from a split lip. Detective Frank Russo stood over him, breathing hard, his right hand still stinging from the impact. Around them, 6 other cops watched in silence, their faces ranging from shock to carefully maintained neutrality. Outside, the summer heat pressed against the windows like something alive, and the streets of Harlem hummed with music and laughter, completely unaware of what had just happened. What none of them knew, not Russo, not the other cops, not even Bumpy himself in that exact moment, was that this single act of violence would set in motion a chain of events that would change the balance of power in Harlem forever. In less than 24 hours, Detective Frank Russo would vanish from the face of the earth, leaving behind only questions, rumors, and a lesson that would be whispered about in precincts and criminal circles for decades to come. But to understand what happened in those 24 hours, you need to understand who these men were, the world they operated in, and why a slap delivered in anger could carry a death sentence. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson wasn't born a legend. He was born in Charleston, South Carolina in 1905, the son of a laborer and a woman who cleaned white people's houses. He came to Harlem during the Great Migration, just another Southern black kid looking for something better than the suffocating racism of the Jim Crow South. What he found in Harlem was different, but not necessarily better. A place where opportunity existed, but only if you were willing to take it by force. The young Bumpy had a quick mind and quicker fists, and he fell in with Stephanie Saint, Claire, the legendary queenie of the Harlem numbers racket. She taught him the business. She taught him strategy. More importantly, she taught him that in a world designed to crush people who looked like them, intelligence was a weapon more powerful than any gun. By 1952, Bumpy Johnson was 47 years old and ran more of Harlem's underworld than anyone else, including the Italian mob families that thought they owned the city. He controlled the numbers, he controlled the protection rackets, and most importantly, he controlled the flow of information through the neighborhood. People came to him to solve problems the police wouldn't touch, or worse, were causing. He had done time in Sing Sing and Alcatraz, and those years had refined him, turning raw ambition into calculated strategy. He didn't dress flashy, he didn't carry guns everywhere, he didn't need to. Everyone knew who he was and what he was capable of. He walked through Harlem like a mayor, stopping to talk to old women on stoops, handing money to kids who needed shoes, settling disputes between shopkeepers. The badge didn't rule Harlem, Bumpy Johnson did. Detective Frank Russo was a different breed entirely. 38 years old, thick-necked and red-faced, he'd been on the force for 14 years and had spent the last 7 in Harlem. He wasn't the worst cop in the precinct. That distinction belonged to several others who made Russo look like a saint, but he was dirty in the way that mattered most to the people of Harlem. He took money from the mob to look the other way on their operations while coming down hard on the black-owned numbers runners. He planted evidence when he needed arrests. He used his badge as a license to intimidate, to steal, to hurt anyone who didn't show him what he considered proper respect. And he had a particular hatred for Bumpy Johnson, a hatred born from the simple fact that Bumpy refused to acknowledge Russo's authority, refused to pay him tribute, and represented everything Russo couldn't control. They'd had run-ins before. 3 years earlier, Russo had tried to shake down one of Bumpy's operations, only to find himself facing a room full of witnesses and a lawyer who appeared within minutes, armed with documentation that would have ended Russo's career if it reached the right desk. Russo had backed down that time, but the humiliation festered. Then there was the incident with Russo's nephew, a small-time dealer who'd tried to set up shop in Bumpy's territory, without permission. The kid had been sent home to Brooklyn with a broken arm and a message: "This isn't your place." Russo took it personally. He took everything personally. The arrest that brought Bumpy to the 28th precinct that August night was bullshit, and everyone knew it. Two of Russo's boys had grabbed Bumpy outside the Rhythm Club on Lenox Avenue, claiming they'd witnessed him participating in an illegal gambling operation. Never mind that Bumpy had been in the club talking to the owner about a legitimate business investment, or that a dozen witnesses could verify he'd touched nothing more illicit than a glass of bourbon. Russo didn't need a real crime. He needed an excuse to get Bumpy in handcuffs, to drag him through the precinct, to remind everyone that the badge still mattered. The booking area was a long, narrow room with institutional green walls and fluorescent lights that made everyone look sick. It smelled of sweat, cigarette smoke, and the particular funk of human desperation that accumulates in places where freedom goes to die. Bumpy stood at the desk while the booking sergeant, a tired Irish cop named McCarthy, went through the motions of processing the arrest. McCarthy had been on the force for 23 years, and he'd learned early that the best way to survive was to keep your head down and your opinions to yourself. He didn't like Russo, few cops did, but he liked his pension more than he disliked crooked cops. Russo had been pacing back and forth, working himself up, his voice getting louder with each pass. He was talking about respect, about the law, about how people like Bumpy thought they were above consequences. It was a performance for the other cops in the room, a way of asserting dominance and justifying what he was doing. Bumpy ignored him completely, his face neutral, his eyes focused somewhere in the middle distance. This was the thing that drove men like Russo crazy: Bumpy's complete lack of fear, his refusal to acknowledge their power. "You think you're special?" Russo had demanded, stepping closer. "You think because these people in Harlem treat you like some kind of king that you're untouchable?" Bumpy had looked at him then, really looked at him, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost gentle. "I think," he said slowly, "that you're making a mistake you're going to regret." That's when Russo hit him. It wasn't a punch exactly, more of an open-handed slap, the kind designed to humiliate rather than injure. The sound cracked through the room, and Bumpy's head snapped to the side. Blood appeared immediately, welling from where his tooth had cut the inside of his cheek. For a moment, everything stopped. The booking sergeant's pen hovered over the arrest form. The other cops in the room seemed to stop breathing. Bumpy slowly turned his head back to face Russo, and there was something in his eyes that made Russo take an involuntary step backward. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," Bumpy said quietly. Then he smiled, blood visible on his teeth. "But you'll figure that out soon enough." McCarthy, the booking sergeant, finished processing Bumpy in record time. He wanted this situation resolved, wanted everyone out of his area before whatever was building in the air had a chance to explode. Bumpy made his one phone call to a lawyer who would have him out within hours, and was led to a holding cell. Russo watched him go, and for just a moment something like doubt flickered across his face. Then he laughed, loud and forced, and clapped one of the other cops on the shoulder. "That's how you handle these mutts," he announced. "Show them who's in charge." Nobody responded. They filed out slowly, heading home or to their next shift, and Russo was left alone in the booking area with McCarthy. The sergeant looked up from his paperwork, his face carefully neutral. "You know who that was, right?" McCarthy asked quietly. "I know exactly who that was," Russo snapped. "Some numbers runner who thinks he's untouchable." McCarthy nodded slowly, then went back to his forms. "Hope you're right," he said, but so quietly that Russo couldn't be sure he'd heard it at all. Bumpy Johnson made bail at 6:15 a.m., walking out of the precinct into a Harlem morning that was already hot and humid. His lawyer, David Winters, a sharp young black attorney who'd graduated from Howard University Law and had made it his mission to challenge police corruption, was waiting with a car. They drove in silence for several blocks before Winters spoke. "This isn't the first time Russo's crossed a line," he said carefully. "But if you're planning what I think you're planning—" "I'm not planning anything," Bumpy interrupted, his voice mild. "I'm a legitimate businessman who was falsely arrested and assaulted by a police officer. I believe the proper recourse is a formal complaint and possibly a civil suit." Winters glanced over, trying to read his client's face. "Right," he said slowly. "Of course." They drove through Harlem as it woke up, shopkeepers rolling up their gates, early workers heading to subway stations, kids playing in the spray of fire hydrants already turned on against the heat. People saw Bumpy in the car and waved. He waved back, his face calm and pleasant, showing no sign of the night he'd just endured. When they reached his brownstone on 147th Street, Bumpy thanked Winters and got out, standing for a moment on his stoop, looking up and down the block at his kingdom. Inside he showered, changed into a fresh suit, and made breakfast. Then he made a series of phone calls. The first call was to a man named Moses Carter, who ran a small security consulting firm that employed several former military personnel. The second was to Jimmy Three Fingers Malone, who had contacts in the city assessor's office and knew where to find information that wasn't quite public record. The third was to his nephew Clarence, who had recently returned from Korea and was learning the family business. The fourth was to a woman named Irene Tucker, who worked as a secretary in the NYPD's Internal Affairs Division and supplemented her income by occasionally sharing information about investigations and officer records. By noon, Bumpy Johnson knew everything there was to know about Detective Frank Russo. He knew about the house in Queens that Russo had purchased 3 years earlier on a salary that shouldn't have covered the down payment. He knew about the weekend trips to Atlantic City, about the girlfriend Russo kept in an apartment on the Upper East Side, about the gambling debts Russo had paid off with suspicious regularity. He knew about every formal complaint filed against Russo, 17 in total, none of which had resulted in serious consequences. He knew about Russo's partners, his habits, his schedule, and his weaknesses. More importantly, Bumpy knew something that Russo had worked very hard to keep hidden. Frank Russo had a son from a previous relationship, a 16-year-old boy named Tommy who lived with his mother in New Jersey and who Russo visited every other Sunday like clockwork. The boy didn't know his father was a cop. As far as Tommy knew, his dad worked in city administration, and the money he sent every month came from a boring desk job. Russo had gone to significant lengths to keep these worlds separate, and with good reason. Having a kid made you vulnerable, gave your enemies a target they could use against you. Bumpy put down the phone and sat for a long time in his study, thinking. Outside, Harlem went about its business. Music drifted up from the street, mixing with the sounds of traffic and conversation and life. He touched his split lip gently, tasting blood. Then he picked up the phone and made one more call. "I need you to deliver a message," he said to the person who answered. "Tonight, and I need you to make absolutely certain he understands I'm serious." At 8:30 that evening, Detective Frank Russo sat in his usual booth at Maloney's bar in Queens, nursing his third whiskey and feeling good about himself. He'd told the story of slapping Bumpy Johnson 4 times now, each telling getting a little bigger, a little more dramatic. The other cops at the bar were laughing, buying rounds, treating him like he'd done something worthy of celebration. The incident from the night before was already taking on the dimensions of legend in his mind. The time he put Bumpy Johnson in his place showed him that the law still mattered in this city. He was so focused on his story, so surrounded by the warm glow of alcohol and approval that he didn't notice the man who slid into the booth across from him until it was too late. Moses Carter was 62 years old, built like a boxer who'd stayed in shape, and wearing a suit that was just expensive enough to signal that he wasn't someone who could be dismissed easily. He placed a manila envelope on the table between them and folded his hands over it. Russo's smile faded. "This is a private party," he said, his voice hardening. "You need to move along." "I have a message from Mr. Johnson," Carter said quietly. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but there was something in his eyes that made the other cops at the bar slowly quiet down and pay attention. "He wanted me to make sure you received it personally." Russo's face flushed red. "You've got a lot of nerve." "The envelope, detective." Carter slid it across the table. "Look inside, then we'll talk." Russo wanted to refuse, wanted to tell this messenger to go to hell, wanted to arrest him just for having the audacity to approach him in his own bar, but something in Carter's absolute calm made him hesitate. Slowly, aware that every cop in the bar was now watching, Russo picked up the envelope and opened it. Inside were photographs. The first showed Russo accepting a cash-stuffed envelope from Carmine DeLuca, a known mob associate, behind a restaurant in Little Italy. The second showed Russo and his girlfriend entering her apartment building, time-stamped and dated. The third showed Russo at a poker game in a warehouse that had been raided 3 months earlier, a raid that Russo had somehow failed to participate in despite being scheduled for duty that night. But it was the fourth photograph that made Russo's hands start to shake. It showed Tommy, his son, leaving his high school in New Jersey. The boy was smiling, his backpack slung over one shoulder, completely unaware that he was being photographed. In the corner of the photo, written in neat handwriting, was the school's address and the times Tommy's classes ended each day. "You son of a bitch," Russo breathed. He looked up at Carter with fury in his eyes. "If you think—" "Mr. Johnson wanted me to be very clear," Carter interrupted, his voice never rising above conversational level. "He's not interested in your son. He's not interested in hurting anyone who doesn't deserve to be hurt. But he is very interested in making sure you understand the position you're in." He leaned forward slightly. "You put your hands on him, detective, in front of witnesses, in a police precinct. You humiliated him, and you did it because you thought you could get away with it." "He's a criminal," Russo hissed. He gets to do exactly what he wants in his neighborhood," Carter said flatly. "That's the reality you keep refusing to accept. Those people you push around, those businesses you shake down, those arrests you fabricate, they're his people, his businesses, his territory. And you've been operating there on borrowed time." He tapped the photographs. "This is your bill coming due." Russo looked around the bar, at the other cops who were watching but not intervening, at the bartender who was very deliberately not looking in their direction. He realized with a sinking feeling that no one was going to help him, that whatever was happening here was between him and Bumpy Johnson, and that the badge on his belt meant exactly nothing in this moment. "What does he want?" Russo asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Carter reached into his jacket and pulled out a single sheet of paper, typed neatly. "You're going to tender your resignation, effective immediately. Medical leave first, then retirement. You're going to tell anyone who asks that you're moving to Florida for health reasons. You're going to take your pension, take your girlfriend, and you're going to disappear from New York." He placed the paper on top of the photographs. "If you do this, those photographs disappear. Your son stays safe. Your secret stays secret. You get to live out your life without looking over your shoulder. And if I don't?" Russo's voice shook with suppressed rage. Carter's face showed nothing. Then Mr. Johnson stops being patient. Those photographs go to Internal Affairs, to the FBI, and to several newspapers that would be very interested in a story about NYPD corruption. Your son learns what his father really is. Your colleagues learn what you've been doing. And that's just the beginning. He paused. Mr. Johnson is offering you a way out, Detective. He's being generous because he understands you have a family to think about. But this offer expires in 24 hours. Make the call, file the paperwork and walk away, or refuse, and see what happens. Carter stood up, buttoning his jacket. You have until 8:30 tomorrow night to make your decision. If we don't see that resignation by then, Mr. Johnson will consider negotiations closed. He looked down at Russo one last time. For what it's worth, Detective, you should take the deal, because the alternative isn't something you want to experience. Then he walked out of the bar, leaving Russo alone with the photographs and a choice that really wasn't a choice at all. The cops at the bar slowly started talking again, but the energy had changed. Russo sat in his booth, staring at the pictures spread out before him, his mind racing. He thought about calling his captain, about organizing a raid on Bumpy's operation, about showing this criminal bastard that you don't threaten police officers. But even as the thoughts formed, he knew they were fantasy. The photographs were real, the evidence was damning, and Bumpy Johnson had made it clear that he had the power to reach anywhere, to hurt anyone, to destroy Russo's life with a phone call. Russo ordered another drink, then another. By the time he stumbled out of Maloney's around midnight, he'd made his decision. He hated it, hated Johnson for putting him in this position, hated himself for being in a spot where he could be blackmailed. But he had a son to think about, a life to salvage, and pride wasn't worth dying over. Or so he told himself as he drove home through the empty streets of Queens, the photographs burning a hole in his jacket pocket. What Detective Frank Russo didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Bumpy Johnson had made these same calculations hundreds of times before. This wasn't about revenge, not really. It was about power, about maintaining order, about sending a message that would echo through every precinct in the city. You could hassle Bumpy's people, you could make a few arrests, you could even make yourself some money on the side as long as you stayed within certain boundaries, but you didn't put your hands on him, you didn't humiliate him in public, and you certainly didn't do it with the smug assumption that your badge made you untouchable. The next morning, Wednesday, Russo woke up with a hangover and a decision to make. He called in sick to work, then spent 2 hours sitting at his kitchen table, looking at the resignation letter Carter had given him. His girlfriend found him there, still in his undershirt, an empty coffee cup in front of him. "What's wrong?" she asked, concerned. She'd never seen him look this defeated. "Nothing," he lied. "Just thinking about maybe retiring early. Moving somewhere warm." She looked at him strangely but didn't push. They'd only been together 8 months, and she'd learned that there were parts of his life he didn't discuss. She made breakfast while he continued to stare at the letter, weighing his options and finding all of them bad. By noon, Russo had convinced himself there might be another way. He called a friend in Internal Affairs, carefully fishing for information about whether there were any active investigations into his activities. The friend was evasive, which told Russo everything he needed to know. Either there was already an investigation, or one could be started easily. He called his union rep next, asking hypothetically about what kind of legal protection an officer might have if evidence of misconduct surfaced. The rep's answer was discouraging. If the evidence was solid, the union could only do so much. Every avenue Russo explored led to the same conclusion. Bumpy Johnson had him boxed in completely. The bastard had done his homework, covered every angle, anticipated every possible response. It was humiliating, being outmaneuvered so thoroughly by a criminal, but there was a grudging respect beneath the humiliation. This was why Johnson had survived and thrived for decades in a world that chewed up and spit out men like candy. He was always 3 steps ahead, always prepared, always holding cards no one knew he had. At 3 p.m., Russo drove to Tommy's school in New Jersey, parking across the street where he could watch the entrance. When his son emerged at 3:30, laughing with friends, completely carefree and innocent, Russo felt something break inside his chest. The boy was 16, playing basketball after school, worried about girls and grades and whether he'd make the varsity team. He had no idea his father was a dirty cop, had no idea that dangerous men knew his name and his schedule, had no idea that his entire world could come crashing down because of choices his father had made years ago. Russo watched Tommy until he disappeared around a corner, then sat in his car for another hour, crying. Not just for his son, though that was part of it. He was crying for the man he'd wanted to be when he joined the force, for the ideals he'd abandoned one small compromise at a time, for the fact that a street criminal from Harlem had more honor and integrity than he did, because that's what this really came down to. Bumpy Johnson was keeping his word, offering a way out, protecting an innocent kid, even though he had every reason to want revenge. What would Russo have done in the same situation? He knew the answer, and it shamed him. By 7 p.m., Russo was back in Queens, sitting in his captain's office, handing over the resignation letter. Captain Henry Morrison was a 30-year veteran with a face like a roadmap and eyes that had seen everything the job could throw at a man. He read the letter twice, then looked up at Russo with something like sympathy. "This is sudden," Morrison said carefully. "Everything okay?" "Medical issues," Russo replied, sticking to the script Carter had provided. "My doctor thinks the stress is catching up with me, high blood pressure, that sort of thing. He's recommending I retire while I still can enjoy it." Morrison studied him for a long moment. "This wouldn't have anything to do with what happened in the 28th on Monday night, would it?" Russo's heart skipped. "Sir?" "I heard you had a run-in with Bumpy Johnson. Heard you got physical during booking." Morrison's voice was neutral, giving nothing away. "That's a dangerous game to play with a man like that." "I can handle," Russo started, then stopped himself. "It doesn't matter now. I'm done." Morrison nodded slowly. "For what it's worth, Russo, you're probably making the right call. Men like Johnson, they don't forget and they don't forgive. The smart play is always to walk away." He signed the resignation letter and placed it in his outbox. "I'll process this today. You'll be on terminal leave as of tomorrow morning. Take care of yourself." Russo left the precinct for the last time at 7:45 p.m., carrying a small box with his personal belongings. A few cops nodded to him as he passed, but no one asked questions. They'd all heard what happened at Maloney's, had all seen the writing on the wall. In the brutal arithmetic of street-level power, Bumpy Johnson had won and Russo had lost, and there was no point pretending otherwise. At exactly 8:30 p.m., Moses Carter received a phone call confirming that Russo's resignation had been filed. He called Bumpy Johnson immediately to relay the information. "How'd he take it?" Bumpy asked. "Like a man who knows when he's beaten," Carter replied. "He'll be gone within a month, probably less." "Good." There was a pause. "The photographs?" "Already destroyed, just like you promised. The kid never needs to know any of this happened." Bumpy hung up the phone and sat back in his chair, touching his split lip, which was already healing. Outside, Harlem was alive with music and voices, with people living their lives in the territory he protected. The slap had cost Russo everything, his career, his dignity, his future in New York. But it had cost Bumpy nothing except a little pride, and pride was something he'd learned to manage a long time ago. The real lesson, the one that would ripple through every precinct and every street corner in New York, was that the badge didn't make you powerful. It made you a target if you didn't understand the rules of the world you were operating in. Russo had thought he could humiliate Bumpy Johnson because he wore a shield and carried a gun. He'd learned in the space of 24 hours that real power had nothing to do with symbols and everything to do with strategy, patience, and the willingness to do what was necessary without losing your humanity in the process. Frank Russo left New York 3 weeks later, driving south with his girlfriend toward a small town in Florida where nobody knew his name or his history. He'd sold his house at a loss, cashed out his pension, and disappeared from the city that had made and broken him. The official story was medical retirement, stress-related illness, nothing unusual. The unofficial story, the one that was whispered in bars and precinct hallways, was that he'd crossed Bumpy Johnson and lived to tell about it only because Johnson had chosen mercy over revenge. In the years that followed, the story of the slap and its aftermath became a kind of parable among both cops and criminals in New York. It was told to young officers as a cautionary tale about respecting boundaries and understanding that the law existed in a complicated relationship with the streets it supposedly controlled. It was told to young hustlers as proof that Bumpy Johnson was different from other criminals, that he valued strategy over violence and kept his word even when dealing with enemies. Tommy Russo, the 16-year-old boy who never knew how close he came to having his life destroyed, graduated high school, went to college, and eventually became a social worker in New Jersey, helping at-risk kids navigate systems that were designed to fail them. He remembered his father as a distant figure who sent money and visited occasionally, who retired early and moved to Florida for health reasons. He never saw the photographs, never knew about the envelope, never understood that Bumpy Johnson had chosen to protect him when he could have used him as a weapon. Bumpy Johnson continued running Harlem for another 16 years until his death from a heart attack in 1968. By then, the world had changed. The civil rights movement had shifted the nature of power in black communities. The drug trade was transforming the criminal underworld, and a new generation was rising that didn't remember or care about the old rules. But those who had known him, who had seen him operate, who had learned from his example, they remembered. They remembered that he'd faced down mob bosses and corrupt cops, that he'd built an empire on intelligence and loyalty, that he'd understood the difference between seeming powerful and being powerful. The slap that Frank Russo delivered in a police precinct booking area at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in August 1952 lasted less than a second. The consequences lasted a lifetime. Russo spent the rest of his days in Florida, working security at a retirement community, dying alone in a hospital in 1974 without ever returning to New York. He'd told people the story sometimes, late at night, when he'd had too much to drink, about the time he'd crossed Bumpy Johnson and lived to regret it. But he always left out the parts that mattered, the photographs, the choice. The moment he realized that the badge he'd trusted to protect him was nothing but metal and leather against the kind of power that Johnson represented. There's a lesson in all of this, one that transcends the specific details of corrupt cops and crime bosses in 1950s Harlem. It's a lesson about power and consequences, about the difference between authority and respect, about the dangers of mistaking symbols for substance. Frank Russo wore a badge, carried a gun, and had the entire machinery of the state supposedly backing him up. But when it mattered, when he'd put his hands on someone who understood power in a deeper, more fundamental way, all of that meant nothing. He'd played a game whose rules he didn't understand against an opponent who'd written the rule book, and he'd lost before he even realized the game had started. Bumpy Johnson never raised his voice, never made a threat that wasn't already backed by action, never needed to prove his power because everyone could see it in operation every day. That's what real power looks like, not the loud displays, not the violence for its own sake, not the constant need to remind everyone who's in charge. Real power is quiet, strategic, patient, and utterly certain of itself. It doesn't need to slap anyone to prove its point. It just needs to make a phone call, deliver a message, and watch as the inevitable unfolds. The 24 hours between the slap and Rousseau's resignation were some of the longest of the detective's life, filled with fear and realization and the slow, creeping understanding that he'd made a mistake that couldn't be unmade. For Bumpy Johnson, those same 24 hours were just another Tuesday and Wednesday, just another problem solved with the same tools he'd been using for decades: information, leverage, strategy, and the ability to see 3 moves ahead while his opponents were still figuring out the board. That's the story of how a corrupt cop slapped Bumpy Johnson and disappeared 24 hours later. Not disappeared into the East River, not disappeared into a shallow grave, but disappeared into a self-imposed exile in Florida, stripped of everything that had made him feel powerful, living out his days knowing that he'd been outplayed by a man the law said was beneath him. Some fates are worse than death, and some lessons are learned too late to matter. The streets of Harlem remember both men now only in stories, in legends, in the kind of whispered history that gets passed down from old-timers to young ones trying to learn how the world really works. Frank Rousseau is remembered as a cautionary tale, a man who mistook a badge for power and paid for it. Bumpy Johnson is remembered as something else entirely, a king who didn't need a crown, a leader who understood that sometimes the most powerful move is the one that looks like mercy, and a strategist who knew that the best revenge isn't violence, but making your enemy live with the consequences of underestimating you. The slap echoed through the precinct hallway like a gunshot. 24 hours later, it was still echoing, but Frank Rousseau was already gone, already learning to live with the sound of it in his memory, already understanding that in the final accounting, he'd been the one who got hit,